Greetings and welcome to the Elephant TV. My name is Joe Kobuthi. Today I'll be speaking to Irungu Houghton. Mr. Irungu is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya, an author, public intellectual, and a vocal advocate for human rights. Karibu.
Thank you very much, Joe.
To start this conversation, Irungu, the world post-COVID seems very strange, right? I mean, many things are happening. Tectonic shifts locally and globally are moving quite fast. For the human rights discourse, for the last 60 years post World War II, has had a fairly stable run, but also fairly stable, in terms of American as the watchdog, things were moving in a particular direction. Now things seem in flux. What does all this mean for the human rights discourse, both in theory and in practice, as we stand today?
Well, I mean, I think the thing we always have to remember is that even, back in 1948 when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated, there was both conservatism and radicalism in that moment, right? So the radical was the idea that the declaration that all human beings, all people are to be treated equally, that they would have the same rights. These rights would be both political, they would be social and economic. But at the same time, as they met in Paris to debate this, 75% of the world were still under colonialism, and I often remind people that when they were discussing, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Dedan Kimathi and the Kenya Land and Freedom Army were in forests, essentially fighting for the human rights that were being described in the imperial capitals across the world. So there's always been that contradiction, and I think the contradiction of radicalism and conservatism has always been part of the movement. In this particular period, I think what I feel is very different is, I guess, three things. One is that, we have now I guess what some call decaying democracy. So the concept of even liberal democracy has begun to break down in places where you couldn't even have imagined this, the United States of America, Sweden, Italy, places where, historically they have been much more, I guess what you'd say, liberal and democratic in the way that they have governed themselves. But now you're seeing signs of fascism, you're seeing signs of xenophobia, you're seeing signs of homophobia and even racism, and I think that's one of the shifts that we need to recognize. The second thing is that we are seeing increasingly now, a disconnect between online activism and I guess what we could call offline activism, and that those two worlds sometimes are so far apart from each other that they actually don't make the intended impact that they could. Right? So, the rise of the social media platforms, their algorithms, the way that they don't moderate their content, the way that they don't intervene to stop or to kill, vitriolic or virulent hate speech. This is the second big challenge, I think, for many of us in this sector. The third one, obviously, is an increasing polarization in society, many times based on identities, but primarily what is fundamental is the mindsets, it's the perceptions that are there. So that, how this plays out in countries like, from the United States to Kenya, is that you have increasingly now very fixed, rigid mindsets that are counterposed against each other, right? And the concept of tolerance, the concept of acceptance, the concept of empathy is gradually being crushed by an antipathy and a intolerance and a sense of the other. And I think these are the three big challenges that this period has for us, notwithstanding, of course, the bigger ones like climate change and I guess the collapse of the UN and intergovernmental order.
And what does the rise of China, Turkey, India, Russia play along all this? Because I mean, in the past, you had a very centered West advocating, being really the global voice, exactly, towards human rights, etc. But now we're seeing powers like China, Russia, India, Turkey, not particularly advocating for this at the global stage. What does this new context, but also global realignment, mean to human rights discourse today?
Yeah, I mean, of course, historically, if you think about the post Second World War period, you had the Cold War, and part of the contradictions of that period play out even within Amnesty International. So, for example, one of the reasons that Amnesty International doesn't take a position on the quality of elections, whether they're free or fair, harkens back to the period when our movement was spread across the two blocks, particularly the East and the West. And we didn't want to take a position on, I guess what you'd call liberal democratic elections as being the model, as we would, prejudice against the Soviet bloc, where it wasn't the case, for example. More recently, 10 years ago, you had the emergence of the BRIC countries. I think it was Brazil, Russia, India, and the C was, if I remember, China, of course. And that was the beginnings of, I guess, what you would call a challenge of the Western hegemony, North America and Europe. Now, 10 years on, the BRIC model is in disarray in terms of providing a value-based, progressive orientation to the world. So you've seen, for example, regressions in terms of anti-democracy or authoritarian regimes in India, in Brazil, in Russia, and in China. And therefore, I think what we have in this period of 2020s is really a much more multipolar world. Not just 5 or 6 poles, but I think ultimately you've got many, maybe over 100 different poles. And how this shows up for Kenyans, I think in some ways is, I remember not so long ago, maybe about 20 years ago, we would go to cocktails hosted by ambassadors, and there you would find 5 or 6 cabinet secretaries, and you would find senior government officers, you would find senior state officers present. And 15 years later, as I go to these cocktails, I find less and less senior government representation, and in some cases even NGO representation, that people have stopped going to those cocktails because they've realized that actually the power has shifted. And I think that's a fundamental principle that we have to understand, that in a country like Kenya, the government is occupied, not just this government, even the previous government, are occupied by people who understand the concept of national sovereignty. They understand the importance of being independent, if not completely independent, at least nominally independent. And that's why I think, following the transformation around revenue collection during the Kibaki regime, what you found was a much more muscular middle-class political elite that was actually convinced that they did not have to run after ambassadors in the way that they did in the past. And that's why a hemstone, an ambassador hemstone, the US ambassador of yesteryear, has not really shown up in the Kenyan context, because the context has shifted. Right now, I think post-election, we have a number of embassies who are actually only interested in trade and commercial relationships. They're only interested in Kenya's potential as a geopolitical anchor state. And therefore, concerns that were traditionally there in terms of good governance, separation of powers, rule of law, constitutionalism, and anti-corruption have now taken second seat. And that's fundamental for human rights and justice organizations.
Speaking of this, earlier you mentioned the online, offline as a problem in the human rights discourse. But if you look at the last 10, 15 years around not just Kenya, but around the world, a lot of language around human rights has become center stage, in the last couple of years, it was wokeness, right? Where movements such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, and had one can argue, fairly huge amounts of success around advocating for whatever kind of human rights they're advocating for. But conversely, if you look at the Ibrahim Index 2022, states that there's still a democratic decline across the region. Right. So one wonders if language is important, particularly in advocating for issues, yes, the democratic decline, what's the missing link?
Yeah. So first of all, just to say that language matters, words matter, concepts matter, because they frame our experience of the world, but they don't matter as much as the lived experiences of millions of people. And it's ultimately to those people that we must turn always to ask, are we making progress? Are you more secure? Do you have more opportunity to get medical attention? Do you have health services? Do you have education services? Do you feel equal under the law? And if the answer to that is no, then actually the language is still only a means towards getting to the lived experiences that we would want for our people. I think we also have to acknowledge that language can be appropriated, and double-speak politicians are as Kenyan, as Brazilian, as the US, as as Norway and Sweden, right? And so we have to be very clear that as people speak, they take actions consistent with the things that they talk about. I think it's really important that we we are able to hold people accountable, not just for the words that they utter, but for the actions that they take. And I think, we know this very much even from the 1980s and 90s, where you had a whole generation of leaders. If I think back to 1994 during the Pan-African Congress, where you had, for example, Presidents Museveni, Afewerki, Rawlings, who else was in that space? Of course, Kagame was there. There was a whole sea change of young leaders that were demanding different experiences for their people. And it was an exciting moment. But what we learn is that even 20 years on, that experience, 30 years on, those leaders can decay and can lose sight of what it is that they came to power to create. And it's often said that the most saddest image is a former freedom fighter turned dictator and unable to see any security for his people except through himself.
Interesting. This brings us back to the Kenyan context. So we're in the middle of really, really huge 2022 transition after elections. The economy is in a bad place, right? Fiscal distress. 8 million Kenyans, youth in particular, didn't vote because the language of the discourse of the day, corruption, economics, etc., isn't working. However, in times of austerity, experience teaches us that human rights violations increase. We saw in COVID, we saw gender-based violence increasing. We've seen police brutality, social economic rights. Corruption, it becomes mugging, right? It's no longer corruption; it's extortion and mugging from government officials. I think the question that many Kenyans might be thinking now is that, particularly from the human rights space, they're wondering, how do you translate what's happening, particularly around governance and the economy, to create a kind of conveyor belt for human rights discourse to energize the conversation such that it becomes a galvanizing issue.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is not to go back to, I think, one of the weak points of the human rights movement, historically, which was this idea that somehow you could divide rights in terms of civil and political on one hand, and then economic and social on the other hand, and these two had to be kept separate. And what we learn with poor people or people who are marginalized and living in poverty is that actually their ability, for example, their legal literacy, their ability to interpret the law, their ability to know the penal code, to understand the Criminal Procedure Act, is as important as them not, as them not starving, right? And that actually these two sets of, realities combine in the human being in a moment, right? So people who are poor are more likely to be extorted or, by police officers. But people who are ignorant of their rights are even more likely to be abused. And I think those two need to be taken hand in hand, particularly in this period. Ultimately, the human rights movement is based on the concept of freedom. And what was interesting about the last elections is two very large political formations. And I go back to that period, to that moment when they had the two big Nairobi rallies. And both of them, if you had just removed the colors, would have been unrecognizable because they were all talking about freedom. Freedom is the source of the human rights movement. It is the source of social justice. The idea that human beings are born free, that they are free to express themselves, they are free to associate, they are free to assemble. These are all freedoms that are enshrined in our constitution now. But we need to bring them to bear on this very situation that you're describing, which is essentially the absence of the right to a job, the absence to the right to a living wage, the absence of the right to a health service that works regardless of whether you're poor or not. So I think that's the challenge. And in Chapter 43 of the Constitution, we're very clear that these rights are progressively attained. They are not absolute in the sense that you don't expect them to be there, but you do have an expectation of the state that it is moving towards that direction. So I think as we look at, for example, recently the supplementary budget, we have to interrogate the huge hike in, for example, the Office of the President's budget comparatively to health and education. We have to look at where are we putting in resources, for example, for menstrual dignity. Are we, as a nation, concerned about the state of our criminal justice system? Is it acceptable to us to have prisons overcrowded and remand centers completely overcrowded? Or are there different ways that we could structure the justice system or the health system so that the limited resources we've got could go a lot further? I think these are the big challenges of the human rights movement right now. I think the second big challenge really is, I think you kind of hinted at it, is how do we frame these issues? And freedom means everything to everybody. In fact, to some of the people who have been economic crimes and corruption suspects, for them freedom has come in a particular way. But I think for the millions of Kenyans who struggle with shelter, struggle with education and health, for them the kind of freedom they want is just the freedom to be free from the mental anxiety of not knowing how they're going to survive that month or that day. And I think that's the challenge. If we can frame the human rights discourse in that way, so that it actually speaks to millions of people rather than to the middle-class English-speaking elite, I think we will see a difference. And then the third one really is thinking about self-emancipation. I think part of the Human Rights Project is essentially giving people the kind of the literacy and the confidence to demand things for themselves. It is not to do things for others. It is essentially in all the spaces that the 56 million Kenyans exist, they have the confidence and they have the clarity to be able to challenge any form of discrimination, any form of violence that they experience, and to essentially be able to follow that through for themselves and not expect an Amnesty International or another human rights organization to do that for them.
I mean, recently, the Deputy President Kashagwa said, something about Kenya and having particular shareholders. And, tied to this statement, there's critiques, particularly of the human rights movement, around the idea of what is a human, right? And who constitutes a human and who has the right to advocate for human rights. So I think this links to the conversation talking about earlier about, the two parties talking about freedom is here, but freedom for who?
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, Kenyans, there's a disgruntledness that Kenyans are now facing today as we speak, especially post the elections, where we have, in a sense, in my view at least, hit at an apex of very many things. 63, we fought for independence. 1991, we passed multi-party. 2002, we removed more in relations. 2010, we passed the constitution. And 2022, there's all this wave about freedom now is here. But with the increased cost of living, with just the space, climate change, many Kenyans are feeling, is it freedom? When you're talking about constitutionalism, good governance, democracy, human rights, is it for me? Is this freedom for me? What do you comment about that?
Yeah. So let me start with the concept of shareholders. I mean, I think the first thing I would do if I had the opportunity to speak directly to the Deputy President is to remind him that just over 6 million people voted for the Kenya Kwanza administration at the national level. 6 million people is less than a tenth of the population of Kenya. It is not what I would call a popular mandate to govern. It is the mandate because I think that's clear. They are the party that won the election according to the Supreme Court and according to the voters that voted. But there is a large number of people who either didn't bother to get up and register to vote, there's a group of people who didn't bother to get out of bed to vote, and there's a whole bunch of people who either are not eligible to vote or just don't think it's a useful exercise, right? So I think one of the things that we have to remind the political class is that they must constantly seek not just a political license to govern in the in the general elections every 4 or 5 years, but they must seek constantly a social license to be able to govern. And a social license is that contract that says that we continue to have faith, to have confidence in your capacity to lead us. As soon as that confidence and that capacity collapses, and it has collapsed in many countries, it collapses in places where you've seen popular revolutions, social revolutions, it's unstoppable. I mean, I used to remind the Inspector General during COVID-19 that you may have 100,000 officers and they may be all armed to the teeth, but we are 56 million Kenyans. The day that we remove from you the right to police us is the day that people will have to go back to the barracks. So you police by consent, you govern by consent. And I think that's the important message back to the political class. At all times, they have to continue enrolling us in their vision, in their leadership, and in their integrity to be able to manage this country. The day they lose that is the day they lose everything. Let me turn to the the kind of perceptions of I guess Kenyans of the Human Rights Project. I mean, I think for many Kenyans, their interest really is in basically just decent work, dignified living, and security. Right? Most Kenyans that's all they want. They just want to be able to enjoy themselves, to not be worried about what's going to happen tomorrow, not be worried about their children or their parents. And that's probably fundamentally where they are. There's a growing number of Kenyans, I think, who are more interested in the management of public affairs, who are concerned about issues like corruption, who are concerned about misuse of office, who are convinced that unless you have people with integrity in the right offices, you can continue to have a nation that doesn't collapse, but ultimately it's not growing. It's not expanding its economy. It's not developing pathways for all these graduates that continue going through the university education, hoping that they will come out the other side as employable. And I think for that group is increasingly looking for signs of leadership. And for us, in terms of our own movement, in terms of the Amnesty movement, that's the category of people that tend to come and join Amnesty. Those are the people who are saying, it is not enough for me to do a little thing in my life, to study or to work or to have a small hustle and to keep going. What they would like to do is they would like to serve much higher than themselves and really create conditions within their communities or in their universities or their schools that allow for nobody to be slammed up against a wall like the late Ebby Samuels 3 years ago and killed simply because the teacher didn't like her hairstyle, or Edwin Chiloba to be in a situation with his lover, his partner, and not be able to even get help from any counselor or any religious person because LGBTIQ persons are criminalized in this country. That's the kind of a republic that would be able to, I guess, protect everybody. And I think that's the role of Amnesty and other human rights organizations, is to continue just calling people to be bigger than they thought they are.
I mean, arguably, human rights are important, right? Mm-hmm. And as they were envisioned in 1948, post-World War II, about 60 years down the road, we have climate change. We have the internet, the connectivity, right. A digital dark age. We have migration issues. So we have new problems. So moving forward, just finally, Irungu, how do we start framing human rights practice around these new, very, very complex problems that we're also still grappling with?
I mean, all the new issues, and if I can add one more that we all experienced for 2 years, like COVID-19, the pandemic, right? All of these don't hang in the air. They actually hang or are anchored into very deep seated governance problems. And those governance problems are primarily social justice and human rights issues. So, for example, you cannot really discuss climate change without looking at issues around environmental degradation or issues around deforestation. And once you start getting into those conversations, then you start thinking, well, okay, hold on a sec. What about all the environmental defenders that continually get killed because they're trying to protect forests? People like Johannes Dutchbury and others. So you will come back to the issue of, the right to organize, the right to free expression, the right to assemble, and so on. And it's the same thing, I think, even with the economy. If we think about the new big issue, I think, which we all have to be thinking about, which is the increasingly indebted economy that we've got. That is also too a human rights issue, because it will essentially impact primarily on the right to education, the right to health, and the right to social services or essential services. So I tend to see these things really not as being, they are new issues in the sense that they've become much more mainstream than they were. In the case of climate change, it's fairly clear that actually the damage started maybe 50, almost 70 years ago, and post-war, really, with the type of industrialization that was being generated during the war and after the Second World War. But the important thing to recognize is that these things, like the experience of a human being, they are completely indivisible and connected. And therefore, as we organize to protect people against the pandemic, we have to make sure that, for example, under the curfew and the emergency orders, do not come licenses to police officers to batter people. One of the most poetic things that I heard during the pandemic, in the early days when there were very few vaccines in the country. And there was an argument that the vaccines that were available should go to the elderly and to the people who had high levels of comorbidity. I suddenly thought, are the Mau Mau and the Kenya Land and Freedom Army veterans being prioritized? And of course, the fathers and the mothers of the nation, are they being prioritized for this? Is there a government program that is reaching out to all these former freedom fighters and saying, in respect to you, can we give you the vaccine first? So at the time that many of my relatives were having vaccine parties in Kileleshwa and Riverside and places like that, where you could drink and somebody would come and vaccinate you regardless of your age, we organized for the Mau Mau Veterans Association Secretary General, Gitwa Kahengere, to come to go to Thika level 4 and get vaccinated. And I requested the Secretary General of the Kenya Medical Practitioners and Dentists Union to essentially administer the vaccine, because I thought this would be a very interesting moment, two Secretary Generals, 2 generations apart. And they met, and Gitwa Kahengere said to Chibanzi Mwachonde, who was then the Secretary General, he says, the reason we went to the forest was for a time just like this. The reason why we fought the British to go beyond, I think it was primary level 2 education, was essentially for a time like this, so that our people would also be doctors and they would protect us from a time when we had a pandemic. And I just thought it was so powerful. And in that phrase, we also can draw strength that the actions that we take today really are designed in a way to create a better future for the children and the children of our children who will come later. And in that recognition, we should have no wish. My view is, personally, is that we should not hold out to be thanked, to be recognized. We may not have letters placed after our names. What we're up to is something much bigger than a state commendation. It's not to be recognized. It's actually to ensure that the rights that we fought for in this generation are experienced much more powerfully in the next generation.
Thank you so much, Irungu, for your time here.
Thank you.